The precise angle of the steel, the exact load a beam could bear before shearing. I see those things in my sleep. It's a language of numbers and stress points, of tension and compression. I saw it in the column of Marcus Thorne's neck the day the federal marshals walked into his boardroom. I saw the exact moment the pressure became too much. The facade cracked. He crumbled. But that moment came much later. The story, my story, began a week before the end, in the dust and silence of my father's study. The air smelled of lemon oil and old paper. I ran a soft cloth over the roll-top desk, my weekly ritual. 7 days until the eviction. 7 days until I was a ghost in my own home. My hand paused over a set of deep gouges in the aged oak. I was 8 years old, carving my initials with a stolen compass. I remembered my father's mock anger, the twinkle in his eye that betrayed his love. This desk was the anchor of my life. I slid open a small, hidden drawer, the wood whispering against wood. Inside was a faded photograph of us on the front porch. A father and son. A home. The quiet of the house was heavy, filled with memories that would soon have nowhere to live. I walked down the hallway, past the stacks of cardboard boxes that had begun to colonize the space. Taped to the front door was a neon orange notice. An official scream in an otherwise silent home. I didn't need to read the words. I knew them by heart. I touched the crisp paper, then let my hand fall. I kept moving, heading to the kitchen to make coffee. The simple routine was a rebellion against the avalanche. The diner smelled of stale grease and regret. Arthur used to come to our house for Sunday barbecues. Now, he sat across from me, refusing to meet my eyes as I spread the loan documents across the sticky table. My hand trembled slightly as I pointed to the discrepancy, the clause that should have protected me. He took a slow sip of his Fiji water. He cleared his throat. My firm has been retained by Thorne Developments on a new project, Liam, he said. The words were quiet, clinical. It's a conflict of interest. I can't represent you. He slid a business card across the table. A legal aid clinic. That thin piece of cardboard felt like the final nail. I didn't know then that it would become the key I'd use to unlock his firm's client list during discovery. The betrayal was absolute. There was no argument. Just a heavy, final silence. I was in the study trying to wrap my father's old architectural books when the doorbell rang. 2 burly movers stood on the porch. "We're here for the desk," the lead one said, looking at a tablet. "Scheduled pickup. Paid for by Mrs. Caldwell." Eleanor. She hadn't even told me. She had just sent men to begin dismantling my life while I was still living in it. I stood in the doorway, a statue of helplessness. They moved with an impersonal expertise, maneuvering the heavy desk, my sanctuary, out of the room and out of my life. Their work order, which I later found crumpled on the floor, would become Exhibit A. The rain started that afternoon. A cold, miserable drizzle that suited the day. A Channel 8 Action News van was parked at the curb, its garish logo an insult to the old brick. I stood across the street, under the useless shelter of a bus stop, a single cardboard box at my feet. A black Mercedes S-Class pulled up. Marcus Thorne emerged, radiating a success so profound it felt like a physical force. Then Eleanor stepped out, impeccable in a tailored coat, a portrait of triumph. They didn't see me. They posed in front of my house, Thorne's arm slung possessively around her shoulder. A camera light clicked on, bathing them in a sterile glow. As a reporter began her spiel about revitalization, Eleanor's eyes scanned the street. They found me. Her practiced smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She gave me a small, almost imperceptible shake of her head. There was no anger, no guilt. It was a look of pure, unadulterated pity. A look that said, "You are pathetic. This is what you forced me to do." That look was the killing blow. It erased me. Just then, the front door of the house opened. The same 2 movers struggled with the weight of the roll-top desk. They maneuvered it down the wet steps, its polished oak gleaming in the camera's light. They placed it on the lawn like a prop. The public humiliation was now complete. Marcus Thorne patted the wood, a familiar gesture that turned my stomach to ice. "We're preserving the history, of course," he said to the reporter, his voice smooth as polished stone, "integrating it into the new design." The broadcast footage of him touching my father's desk would play on a loop for the jury. They saw a predator marking his territory. I saw the moment my rage was forged. He wasn't just taking my house. He was stealing my story. Night fell. I sat on the cold concrete floor of a public storage unit. The only sound was the electric buzz of a single fluorescent bulb overhead. I unpacked the one box I had managed to take. A chipped coffee mug, my father's reading glasses, a bundle of old letters tied with string. I pulled out the faded photograph of the boy and his father on the porch. My hand trembled. I did not cry. I just sat there, under that harsh light, clutching the last piece of wreckage from a life that no longer existed. I ended up back on the street, across from the house. The news van was gone. The rain was falling harder. Lights were on inside. My lights. Occupied by strangers. I was a pathetic cliché, a broken man soaked in the rain. I turned to walk away, a hunched figure disappearing into the gloom. But I stopped at the corner. I leaned against a rain-slicked brick wall, hidden in the shadows. The grief was still there, a cold weight in my chest. But something else was happening. The shame began to cool, to harden. My jaw set. My eyes, which had been vacant with hurt, narrowed. They became sharp, analytical. I was no longer looking at my home. I was studying a structure, a design. I was looking for the flaw. The flicker of rage wasn't hot. It was cold. It was calculated. The hunt had begun. The alarm was a digital shriek in the pre-dawn dark. For 6 months, it had been my world. I slapped the cheap plastic clock into silence and sat up. My bed was a mattress on the floor, surrounded on all sides by a canyon of brown cardboard boxes. They were a constant, suffocating reminder of a life packed away. I navigated the narrow path between them to a hot plate in the corner. The kettle was stained. The water boiled. I poured it over a tea bag in the chipped mug from my study. It was my one remaining relic. My uniform was the same worn-out cardigan. I stood at the grimy window, sipping my tea, looking at a brick wall 3 feet away. This was my life now. A box inside a box. My new job was in the basement of the city records archive. The place was a cavernous, echoing tomb, smelling of dust and decay. My supervisor, a woman half my age with an impatient tap in her fingers, pointed to a trolley of leather-bound ledgers. "These need to be digitized," she said. "They're fragile, so don't screw it up." I spent my days turning brittle, century-old pages under the flat, sterile light of a scanner. A brilliant mind, numbed by repetition. I didn't know it then, but in that graveyard of paper, I was standing on my enemy's unmarked grave. One afternoon, a former colleague from the university walked past. Our eyes met for a second. He gave a quick, awkward nod and hurried away. The silence he left behind was deafening. I had become a fossil, a dusty record of a man who used to exist. My sister called. It was my late mother's birthday next week. She wanted to post a photo online, one of our parents from the 70s. "I think it's in that box of old tax returns," she said. Her voice was cheerful, oblivious. That simple request felt like a violation. It forced me back to the storage unit, to a box labeled Family, Financial. The smell of old paper and mothballs hit me like a physical blow. I wasn't looking for a clue. I was just a son, fulfilling a duty. Back in my apartment, I sat on the floor, surrounded by piles of yellowed receipts and bank statements from a life that felt like someone else's. I found the photo. Tucked behind it, used as a stiffener, was a folded, crisp document. An original property survey from 1956. My grandfather's elegant signature was at the bottom. I almost tossed it aside, but I stopped. From a locked metal box on my desk, I pulled out the foreclosure notice. I flattened both papers on the floor, side by side, under the harsh glare of my single desk lamp. That survey, a forgotten piece of cardboard, would become the fulcrum on which the entire case would pivot. The next day, I was in line at a CVS to pick up a prescription for sleeping pills. I was just another ghost in the city. "Liam? Liam Caldwell?" The voice cut through the fog. It was a neighbor from my old street. Her face was a mask of awkward sympathy. "Oh my," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush. We were all so shocked. "Eleanor seems to be doing wonderfully, though. And that new development, it's all anyone talks about." "She won. You lost." I just nodded, my face a blank wall. "I'm managing," I said. I paid for the pills and walked out. Her pity was a shadow that followed me down the street. Later, on the bus home, traffic stalled. I found myself staring out the window at the facade of a century-old brownstone. For a moment, the broken man vanished. The architectural historian took over. My eyes traced the intricate bond of the brickwork, the elegant curve of the window arches, the detail on the cornices. Without thinking, I pulled a pen from my jacket pocket and began sketching the details on the back of a discarded newspaper. It was a reflex, a ghost of a forgotten passion. The bus lurched forward, and I stopped. I looked down at the drawing, surprised it was my hand that had made it. That night, I looked at the two documents again. The signature on the foreclosure notice was a near-perfect copy of my grandfather's. To a casual eye, they were identical. But I wasn't a casual eye. I leaned in, the historian's instinct for detail taking over. I saw it. On the original 1956 survey, my grandfather's pen stroke for the C in Caldwell had a distinctive, almost imperceptible upward flick at the end. A flourish of confidence. The forgery, for all its precision, was flat. It was a dead copy. It lacked life. That tiny upward flick of ink would later be magnified 1,000 times on a courtroom screen, and it would unwind everything. The fog in my head began to clear, replaced by a razor-sharp focus. And then came the punch. As I stared at the forgery, another memory surfaced. The day Eleanor had me sign the final sale papers, telling me it was a formality. I now realized the signature they had used to force the default, the signature meant to be my father's, had been copied from his will. This wasn't just a financial crime. It was a violation of memory. It was desecration. The spark of hope ignited into a cold fire. I stood up. The tremor in my hands was gone. I walked to the closet and pulled out a long-forgotten portfolio case. Inside were my old architectural tools. Precision rulers, drafting pencils, compasses, relics. I ignored them all and pulled out a single, large sheet of pristine white vellum. I cleared the cluttered coffee table, pushing aside bills and takeout containers. I created a clean, ordered space in the center of the chaos. I laid the white paper down. My hand entered the light and placed the forged foreclosure document in the top left corner. Then, I placed the original survey in the top right. I picked up a sharpened pencil, my face set like stone. I was no longer mourning. I was designing. In the silent, dusty basement of the City Records Archive, I performed my role. I was the diligent archivist, my movements slow and respectful as I digitized a crumbling ledger from 1920. My supervisor would walk by and nod, pleased with my meticulous care. The moment she was gone, I became someone else. The real work began. I abandoned the ledger for the microfiche reader, the rhythmic click-clack of the machine a secret countdown. Reels of property deeds from 2 years ago flew across the screen, my eyes scanning the dense text for a single name, a single lot number. The coffee in my thermos wasn't for warmth. It was fuel. The ghost was gone. The hunter was at work. I met Gladys on a park bench overlooking a drab duck pond. She was in her late 70s, frail but with eyes that missed nothing. I didn't ask her for files. I asked about her son, whose thesis I had helped with years ago. We talked. I eventually steered the conversation to my academic research on zoning variances. "I'm sure you saw it all in your time at the planning department," I said. She smiled, tossing breadcrumbs to the pigeons. "They always thought the old paper files were useless," she said, a twinkle in her eye. "But paper never forgets." A week later, a thick manila envelope was in my apartment mailbox. That manila envelope, filled with dry property records, would later be referred to by the U.S. Attorney as the Rosetta Stone of the entire conspiracy. My apartment transformed. The boxes were pushed to the walls, creating a workspace in the center of the claustrophobic room. The large white paper from that first night was now taped to the wall, a crude but growing conspiracy board. I used red string to connect lot numbers from Gladys's files to newspaper articles about Thorne developments. A pattern emerged. A dozen small, family-owned properties, all bought out cheaply, all after sudden, inexplicable financial hardships. My home was just one node in a cancerous web. The paper trail always led to the same place. A shell corporation. E.M. Holdings. I spent hours on my laptop, running corporate searches. The company was a ghost, a financial black hole designed to be untraceable. It had no assets, no history, no public directors. The trail went cold. I slammed the laptop shut. Frustration was a physical thing, a tightening in my chest. I had the what. I didn't have the who. Late one night, I stepped away from the wall. I needed to clear my head. I picked up a small photo album, one Eleanor and I had kept. I wasn't looking for memories. I was looking for a clear photo of my house to compare with an old zoning map. I flipped through the pages. Us in Italy. A Christmas party. All smiles. I stopped on a photo from a weekend trip a few years back. I was smiling at the camera. Eleanor was next to me, but her attention was elsewhere, completely absorbed in a glossy magazine. I looked closer. On the cover was Marcus Thorne. The headline read, "The man who's reshaping the city." Her admiration for him, her ambition, it had never been a secret. It had been right there, in her hands. I had just refused to see it. I closed the album. The quiet click echoed in the silence. I did my laundry at 3 in the morning. The 24-hour laundromat smelled of bleach and lonely souls. I sat on a hard plastic chair, watching my few clothes tumble in the dryer. Across from me, a young father tried to fold a fitted sheet while his toddler daughter giggled, diving into the warm pile. He scooped her up, exhausted but smiling, and blew a raspberry on her stomach. Her shrieks of pure joy filled the empty space. I watched them, my face unreadable. I looked down at my own small, solitary basket. The weight of what I had lost, not the house, but the simple, warm chaos of a shared life, crushed me. I was profoundly alone. Back in my apartment, I stared at the name on the wall. E.M. Holdings. The M could be Marcus. The E was a blank. I was stuck. I went to a box labeled college to find an old textbook. My fingers brushed against another box. Eleanor, mementos. On a whim of pure, painful nostalgia, I opened it. Her university diplomas were inside. I pulled out her MBA. And there it was, printed in elegant script. Eleanor Madeline Caldwell. The air left my lungs. E.M. It had to be a coincidence. My hands were shaking. I scrambled back to my laptop. I pulled up the corporate registry search. Before, I'd hit a wall. But I remembered something. A security question she always used. A detail she was proud of. The name of her first pet. A cat named Socrates. I typed it in. Access granted. The incorporation document loaded. I scrolled past the legalese to the founding partners. Marcus Thorne, a known Thorne associate. Eleanor Madeline Caldwell. The world stopped. Every ounce of color drained from my face. The focused anger, the intellectual curiosity, it all evaporated, replaced by a hollow, sickening horror. She hadn't just left me. She hadn't just benefited from my ruin. She was the architect. She built the weapon. I became very still. The shock gave way to a profound, terrifying calm. I stood up and walked to the wall. I picked up a black marker. With a steady hand, I drew a thick, black box around the newspaper photo of Eleanor smiling next to Thorne. Then, I drew a single, straight line connecting her face directly to the deed for my family home. It was no longer a map of a conspiracy. It was a diagram of a betrayal. I picked up my phone. I scrolled to her name. The contact photo was from our wedding day. My thumb hovered over the call button. For a heartbeat, the old Liam wanted to scream. I pressed delete. The contact vanished. The love was gone. The grief was gone. All that remained was the cold, clean geometry of revenge. The house had been the target. Now she was. At 5 a.m., my apartment was a clean, ordered space. The boxes were gone. The chaos was gone. On the wall, the web of strings and notes had been replaced by a neat, precise diagram. A blueprint for a war. This was my new ritual. I placed a kettle on the hot plate. While it heated, I unrolled 3 enormous, brittle maps across the clean floor. A 1920 hydrographic survey, a 1955 zoning map, and a modern satellite overlay. These maps, which the city archivist had dismissed as brittle curiosities, would become the state's key exhibits. Using a magnifying glass and a pair of drafting calipers, I measured the ghost of a waterway, my lips moving silently with the calculations. I was excavating through time. When the kettle whistled, I poured the water into my mug and set a small sand timer beside it. 3 minutes. The broken man was gone. A craftsman was at work. I put on my mask. The worn cardigan, the slightly stooped shoulders. At the city planning department, I was invisible. I approached the clerk, a young woman who looked terminally bored. I didn't ask for the files on the Elysian. That would have raised a flag. I'm researching the Old Mill Creek tributary for a local history blog. I said, my voice hesitant, academic. I believe the original survey maps are in the sub-archive. She sighed, seeing no threat, just a pathetic hobbyist. Knock yourself out, she said, pointing to a dark corner of forgotten filing cabinets. I gave her a grateful, pathetic nod and disappeared. They never see the man in the corner. They never look down. The war had costs. I stood in an antiquarian bookshop on the Upper East Side, the air thick with the smell of old leather and money. Between us on the counter was a box of my father's most treasured books. First editions on architectural theory. The dealer, a man in a tweed jacket, offered me half of what they were worth. I felt a muscle in my jaw tighten. I was selling pieces of my father's soul. I needed the money for filing fees and burner phones. The phone I bought with that cash would later provide the cell tower data that placed one of Thorne's men at a suspicious fire. I accepted the offer without a word, my face a blank mask. The sacrifice was a silent, necessary amputation. I stood at a graffiti-covered payphone on a street corner, the roar of traffic providing cover. I used a folded piece of paper to muffle the sound of my fingers on the keypad. I altered my voice, making it older, a little shaky. "Hello," I said when the city inspector's office answered. "I don't want to cause a fuss, but my grandfather used to tell me stories about a waterway under the old Caldwell place. Is someone supposed to check on that before they build that big new glass tower?" I wasn't an accuser. I was a concerned citizen, a ghost of civic duty. I hung up before they could ask a single question. The day of the groundbreaking was bright and clear. The sky was a cruel, perfect blue. At the side of my old home, white tents had been erected. Champagne flowed. Marcus Thorne stood at a podium, the king of his stolen domain. Eleanor was at his side, radiant in a sharp power suit, her smile a weapon. "Today, we break ground on a new vision for this historic community," Thorne proclaimed. The crowd of investors and media applauded. I stood at the absolute fringe of the event, half hidden behind a catering van. I wore a plain baseball cap and sunglasses. I was just a face in the crowd. Anonymous. I watched them, my stillness a coiled spring. The day before, I had visited the local history museum. It was underfunded, dusty, and quiet. I found the exhibit, The Lifeblood of the City, Lost Waterways. In the center was a faded photograph from 1922. Children in suspenders and dresses splashing in the shallows of a creek. The caption read, "Mill Creek, now routed underground." A map showed its path running directly beneath my family's property. I placed my hand on the cool glass. It was not just a legal tactic. It was an act of remembrance. Thorne and Eleanor posed for the cameras, golden shovels in hand. The perfect picture of power. Just as they were about to dig in, a nondescript Ford sedan rolled onto the site. A man in a hard hat and a high-vis jacket got out. He held a clipboard. He looked annoyed. He walked with purpose, straight through the photo op, and right up to Thorne. "Marcus Thorne," he said, his voice flat and loud. "You're in violation of City Bylaw 1138, Section C. This entire site is on a protected historical waterway." He slapped a bright red stop work order onto Thorne's chest. Thorne laughed. "We have every permit. Your permits are for the land," the inspector said, his voice carrying over the suddenly silent crowd. "They don't give you the right to build over a subterranean public trust. This site is shut down." Immediately, Eleanor's perfect smile dissolved. The public triumph became a public humiliation. I watched the beautiful, orchestrated chaos. I saw the flash of panic on Eleanor's face. I saw Thorne's charisma crack, revealing pure, impotent fury underneath. I felt nothing. No joy. No satisfaction. Just the cold click of a lock falling into place. I finished my lukewarm coffee, crushed the paper cup in my hand, and dropped it in a trash can. I walked away, melting back into the city. That night, in his glass-walled office, Thorne would have raged. I could picture him sweeping the model of his precious tower to the floor. But Eleanor, she would have been quiet. She would have been still. "This is not random, Marcus," she would have said, her voice dangerously quiet. "Amateurs make mistakes. This was perfect. Think, who has the time, the patience, and the pathetic, encyclopedic knowledge to find something like that?" And in that moment, she would know. The contempt in her eyes would curdle into something new. Respect and fear. The ghost they thought they had buried was hunting them. And he was much, much smarter than they ever imagined. On a rainy Saturday morning, I sat in a small coffee shop with a university student. Her name was Sarah. Her thesis on early 20th century city planning was a mess of dates and dead ends. Papers and maps were spread between us. "The mistake everyone makes is looking at where the roads are now," I said, pointing to a detail on an old survey map. "You have to look at where they were." Her face was a mask of stress. I explained a complex zoning variance using a simple analogy about a leaky faucet. Understanding dawned in her eyes. "Thank you so much, Mr. Caldwell," she said, the relief in her voice palpable. "I've been stuck for weeks." I smiled. "History is a puzzle," I told her. "You just need to find the right pieces." It was the last moment of peace. Back in my apartment, I was studying my war board when the email arrived. The subject line was from the university's history department. "Urgent, regarding your guest lectureship." The email was curt, formal. It requested an immediate meeting with the dean to discuss a serious allegation of academic misconduct. The impersonal, corporate language was a weapon. All my previous correspondence with the department had been warm, collegial. This was cold. This was a threat. On the way to the university, I stopped at my usual newsstand. Tony, the owner, had been selling me papers for 5 years. That morning, he couldn't look me in the eye. He fumbled with my change. As I walked away, I saw him discreetly turn over the front page of the local paper on his stack. I stopped. I went back and bought one. The article was small, buried on page 6, but the headline was a dagger. "Local historian under investigation for academic fraud." It was a non-story, an internal review, but it had been leaked. The poison was already in the water supply. After the meeting, I walked home in a daze. As I approached my building, a man in a cheap suit stepped from the shadows. "Liam Caldwell." I nodded. He handed me a thick legal envelope. He didn't say another word. He just turned and walked away. I opened it under the flickering hallway light. A restraining order, filed by Thorne Developments. I skimmed the dense legalese, my blood turning to ice. I was barred from coming within 500 feet of any property owned by Thorne. And there it was, listed by name. The City Records Archive. My armory. My entire strategy was built on the history stored in that building. Eleanor had not just countered my move. She had salted the earth where my weapons grew. The Dean of History's office was supposed to be a sanctuary of wood panels and old books. That day, it was an interrogation chamber. Dean Thompson, my former mentor, sat behind his massive desk. He looked tired and ashamed. He didn't offer me a seat. "Liam, I'm so sorry about this," he began. He slid a printed document across the polished wood. An anonymous complaint. It accused me of plagiarizing a paper from a decade ago. It was meticulously detailed. I recognized the project instantly. It was a collaboration. The complaint twisted every fact, reframing shared research as intellectual theft. Eleanor had helped me organize those notes. She knew every detail. She had built this perfect, insidious lie from the foundation of our shared life. That document, which I later learned was sent from a disposable email account, was a masterclass in betrayal. "The board has suspended your lectures and your library access, pending a formal review," the dean said, his eyes finally meeting mine. They were filled with pity. My hands are tied. The institution I had dedicated my life to had folded without a fight. I didn't go home. I couldn't. My apartment was a war room for a war I could no longer fight. I ended up on a desolate pier overlooking the industrial side of the river. The wind was cold. I stood at the end, the restraining order crumpled in my fist. My armory was sealed. My reputation was shot. My identity had been erased. I held the crumpled paper over the dark, churning water. My knuckles were white. It would be so easy to let it go, to let everything go with it. I didn't. I just stood there, motionless, a solitary figure against the cold, uncaring city. I was utterly and completely alone. The next morning, running on nothing but adrenaline, I walked to the City Records Archive. I knew what the paper in my pocket said. I needed to see it. I needed to feel the lock. I walked up the grand marble steps. As I reached for the heavy bronze door handle, Sal, the security guard I'd shared coffee with for months, stepped in my way. His face was pained. "Liam, I'm sorry," he said, his voice low. "I can't let you in." He gestured to a clipboard on his desk. My name was at the top of a list, next to a grainy photo. "They told me to call the police if you try to enter." The public, physical exile from the one place I held power was the final blow. I was no longer a historian. I was a threat. I sat on the floor of my apartment. The war room was in shambles. My precise diagrams were torn from the wall, the papers scattered. A portrait of a defeated mind. Eleanor had beaten me. My entire strategy was built on paper, on history, on access. She had taken it all. I looked at the anonymous complaint letter from the university, the instrument of my ruin. I smoothed it out. It was just a printout. A printout of an email. An email. A digital file. She didn't use a dusty ledger to destroy me. She used a server. She used a keyboard. A thought cut through the despair. I had been fighting a 21st century war with 19th century tools. I was so focused on the building's foundation, I never checked the wiring. I crawled over to my laptop. I opened a web browser. The cash from my father's books was in an envelope on the desk. It wasn't enough for Thorne's legal army, but it might be enough for a different kind of soldier. My fingers, shaking slightly, typed the search query. Freelance digital forensics expert. I had been locked out of the paper house. It was time to find the key to the digital one. At 2 in the morning, the laundromat was my office. The air was thick with the smell of bleach. A security guard was asleep in a plastic chair. To him, I was just another piece of the city's debris, a man with nowhere else to go, nursing a battered laptop for the free, spotty Wi-Fi. It was the perfect camouflage. My clothes, what little I had left, tumbled in a nearby machine. On the screen, hidden from view, encrypted chat windows blinked. File transfers crawled. My mask of the broken man had never been more convincing. I was a ghost, hiding in plain sight. I met my new ally in a crowded food court at lunch hour. Her name was Kira. She had brightly colored hair and a laptop covered in hacker stickers. She talked a mile a minute while eating greasy fries. The anonymous tip against you was a joke, she said, her mouth full. They used a Thorne corporate proxy, but routed it through a public server at the university library. Sloppy. It's like leaving muddy boot prints on a white carpet. She pointed a fry at me. This will cost you the rest of what you have. I slid the envelope across the sticky table. It was the money from my father's books. She took it without counting. The books weren't enough. The next day, I stood in a pawn shop filled with the lost dreams of other people. I placed my father's Omega watch on the glass counter. It was the last thing I had of any value. He had put its twin on my wrist for my university graduation, a symbol of a life that was now gone. That watch was more than just a timepiece. It was a promise I had failed to keep. The pawnbroker offered me a pittance. I took the cash without a word. This was Kira's final payment. I was all in. I had nothing left to lose. That night, my face was illuminated only by the glow of the laptop. Kira was on a video call. Okay, the bait is ready, she said. On her shared screen was an email draft addressed to the university ethics committee. It appeared to be from me. It offered a pathetic apology for my supposed plagiarism. At the bottom was a single, innocuous hyperlink, supporting documentation. Kira smirked. Anyone from Thorne's network who clicks that link to gloat? I'll own them. I gave a single, grim nod. Send it. Eleanor found me in a sterile, overpriced coffee shop. She hunted me down. I looked exactly as she expected, defeated, worn down, pathetic. She sat down, her expensive handbag clicking on the marble table. I hear you're having some trouble at the university, Liam, she said, her voice dripping with false sympathy. She talked about their legal fees from my frivolous injunction. Then she leaned in. Where is all your money going? The books, the watch. I know you, Liam. You're broke. What are you even doing? I slowly looked up from my coffee. I let the silence hang between us, a heavy, unbreathing thing. I held her gaze. My face was a perfect mask of weary obsession. To the lawyer who's taking the house back, I said. I saw it in her eyes. First, a flash of irritation. Then, a wave of profound relief. And finally, a deep, satisfying contempt. Of course, the dusty academic was still obsessed with the old pile of bricks. I was predictable. I was small. She smiled a condescending little smile, stood up, and walked away. She had won. That night, I washed my single mug in the small sink. The wall where my war board had been was blank. The restraining order was tacked by the door, a constant reminder. I dried the mug and put it away. From my pocket, I pulled the pawn ticket for my father's watch. I didn't feel sad. I felt a quiet, profound resolve. I had traded the symbol of my past for a chance at a future. I placed the ticket inside a book and closed it. I was done looking back. My laptop chimed. It was Kira. The background was different. She was in a dark room, surrounded by monitors, the glow reflecting in her glasses. She was ecstatic. We got a click, she said, grinning. A big one. From an executive IP address at Thorne Development's head office. My screen filled with a graphic of the baited link being opened. A connection made. Folder icons began flying across the screen. They didn't just open a file, Liam, Kira's voice said. They opened the door to the whole damn server. I have everything. Financials, permits, offshore accounts. A final folder icon flew forward. It was labeled Internal Comms. Kira's voice was a whisper. And I have every email Eleanor has sent from her Thorne account for the last 3 years. She had clicked the link. Her arrogance was the key. She thought she was reading my surrender. Instead, she had handed me the blueprint to her entire kingdom. I wore my only suit. The law office was sleek, expensive, and intimidating. A world away from my life. I sat opposite Ms. DeLuca, a specialist in financial crime. Between us on the vast mahogany desk was a flowchart I had drawn. It mapped Thorne's entire criminal enterprise, sourced from Kira's data. DeLuca took off her glasses. She looked at me not with pity, but with a new, profound respect. Mr. Caldwell, she said, her voice measured. The evidence you've acquired is comprehensive, but I need you to understand. What you are proposing is not a lawsuit to reclaim a piece of property. She leaned forward. This is a declaration of war against Marcus Thorne's entire financial empire. The broken man was gone. In his place was an architect who had checked every calculation. I know, I said. That's why I'm hiring you. The morning of the hearing, the sun was bright. I sat in a quiet cafe far from the courthouse, a cup of black coffee on the table. I was not reviewing notes. I was sketching on a napkin. I drew the face of Sal, the security guard from the archive. I drew the kind crinkles around his eyes, the slight smile he always had. It was a quiet, focused act, a reminder of the real world. I finished the sketch, folded the napkin, and placed it in my pocket. I drank my coffee, left a few dollars on the table, and walked out into the light. I was at peace. In the cavernous, echoing lobby of the courthouse, Ms. DeLuca was not. They'll come at you hard on the academic fraud, she said, her voice sharp. They'll paint you as a bitter, discredited man. The marble and stone around us were designed to make a person feel small. I looked up at the great dome. Architecture is about truth in materials, Ms. DeLuca, I said calmly. Their entire structure is built on lies. All we have to do is show the judge the blueprint. As I walked toward the courtroom, I passed Dean Thompson. He was there on some other matter. Our eyes met. He looked away, then looked back. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't encouragement. It was a silent acknowledgement. A quiet closing of a door. Marcus Thorne and Eleanor arrived in a whirlwind of confidence and expensive tailoring, flanked by a team of lawyers. They saw me standing alone. Thorne smirked. Eleanor gave me the same look from the day I lost my home. Not malice, just pure, condescending pity. To them, this was a formality. The final swatting of a fly. The hearing room was cold and sterile. No jury, just a judge. Thorne's lead attorney stood, his voice smooth and arrogant. Your Honor, this is a frivolous case brought by a disgruntled individual with a documented history of professional misconduct, stemming from a standard property dispute. He gestured at me. A piece of trash to be swept away. The judge looked to my lawyer. Counselor, Ms. DeLuca rose. She had no notes, no files. Your Honor, she said, her voice cutting through the silence. We are not here today to discuss a property dispute. We are here to present preliminary evidence of a multi-year pattern of racketeering, wire fraud, and money laundering conducted by Mr. Thorne through a network of shell corporations. The room went still. Thorne's lawyer stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. Eleanor's perfect posture stiffened by a millimeter. The judge leaned forward on his elbows. He was listening now. DeLuca placed a tablet on the projector. On the screen appeared my flowchart. It was clean, elegant. A beautiful blueprint of a crime. And this, she said, is the floor plan. As she traced the flow of money from an offshore account to EM, Holdings and finally to the Elysian development, I watched them. Thorne's face was a thundercloud of disbelief turning into pure fury. He leaned toward Eleanor. His whisper was venom. This is you. That ridiculous academic fraud story. What did you do? Her face was a blank mask of terror. Her world was dissolving in real time. She looked at me. I was not looking at her. I was looking at the flowchart on the screen. It was a well-made design. My dispassion was absolute. The prosecutor, who had been observing, stood up. Your Honor, he said, interrupting. In light of this extensive evidence, the state would like to make an offer. He turned and looked directly at Eleanor. He ignored Thorne completely. Miss Caldwell, a deal. Full testimony against Mr. Thorne and his associates in exchange for a significantly reduced sentence. A grenade had been rolled onto the table. Thorne glared at her, his eyes burning with a silent, murderous threat. Her lawyers whispered frantically in her ear. She was trapped. As the silence stretched, Ms. DeLuca rose one last time. She spoke with a quiet finality. "Before my client's wife makes her decision," she said, the word wife landing like a stone, "I am instructed to inform the court that Mr. Caldwell is dropping all civil charges related to the fraudulent acquisition of his personal property." She turned and looked at Eleanor. "He never cared about the house." A look of pure, unadulterated horror bloomed on Eleanor's face. The blood drained from it. The pathetic lawyer, the obsession with the property, my question about where the money was going. It was all a grand, architectural feint. A misdirection. He was never trying to reclaim a memory. He was systematically demolishing her future. I stood up. My work was done. I turned and walked out of the courtroom, leaving the wreckage behind me. I walked out of the grand courthouse and into the afternoon sun. I did not look back. I did not smile. I put my hands in my pockets and walked, blending into the anonymous city crowd. At the crosswalk, I stopped. I pulled the folded napkin from my pocket. I looked at the simple, human face I had drawn. The paper house was gone, and I was free.